Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining this webinar and information session on integrity due diligence in implementers. We are scheduled to start at 11 o'clock. Whilst people are still joining, let me go over a few housekeeping rules. The seminar is being run on Zoom. It is also being recorded. There are interpretations available into Spanish as well as into French. You're seeing the slide at the moment, which shows you how to select the right interpretation by audio and in chat. Also, please feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go on through the presentation. The team will be aggregating them, and once we go to the Q&A, I will be able to go over your questions and answer all of them. Let me just give one quick minute for people to join, and I will proceed with the presentation. Once again, good morning all. I hope the technical side is working well, and you can also put questions in the chat on the technical aspects of things. Our operational communications team is on hand to help you out. And I think we're ready to get started. So if we could please go to the start of the presentation. Thank you very much. Today, we'll spend about an hour talking about the new integrity due diligence guidelines for principal recipients. These operationalize some of the existing policy requirements that we have with regard to various kind of integrity risk and potential misconduct. If we could go to the next slide, please. Just to give a brief overview of what we will be talking about this morning. We will start with a little discussion of what is integrity due diligence, how it relates to the other activities within PRs, and how it addresses the risk management obligations. The purpose of the specific risks we're seeking to target through integrity due diligence, as well as the methods that the Global Fund has developed, both in terms of the overall guidelines and some specific procedural aspects which we have set as minimal requirements that any IDD program must follow, as well as general expectations, understanding that integrity due diligence has to be fitted to a particular context. And so its purpose will vary depending on the integrity risks that a particular PI is facing. We will talk in some detail about these requirements that come out of the guidelines, as well as the modality, how they will be verified. Just importantly to note, straight in advance, that the IDD activities, integrity due diligence, this is something that we expect principal recipients are doing in advance, even before contracting individuals or organizations, before bringing them into the Global Fund implementation structure, before placing reliance and trust on outside organizations. Just obtaining the right level of information, the right level of knowledge about integrity due diligence. So whilst we are for the first time issuing some guidelines and seeking to be a bit more proactive in understanding what PRs do in this space, we very much expect that this is something, a piece of risk management that has been going on as it addresses already existing policy requirements. Could we go to the next slide, please? So, what is integrity due diligence? Very simply and broadly, it is any kind of information gathering and analytical activities undertaken by principal recipients to identify and assess integrity risk. And this is integrity risk with regard to sub-recipients and supply organizations and individuals. Now, integrity due diligence can be broadly understood to happen in various kinds of contexts, but this morning we're specifically talking about principal recipients, and the subjects of integrity due diligence that we are looking at are sub-recipients and suppliers, whether these are organizations or individuals. Now, as I have mentioned, it is likely that your organizations are already conducting numerous types of integrity due diligence as a part of your recruitments, procurements, grant-making activities, such as sub-recipient selection, and general market research. So we're not seeking to introduce any kind of new process, but we have issued these new guidelines for integrity due diligence to ensure some consistency across our implementation structure and making sure that a good, robust standard of a solid IDD program is in place, and that for PRs who are maybe a little bit new to this activity or operate in less mature contexts, they have some information to go on to build out their own IDD program. The key element around which this presentation is structured are the guidelines on sub-recipient and supply integrity due diligence. These are available on our website. We'll have the link of the presentation. You can also, if you just now Google IDD Global Fund, they come out on our website very quickly, and you can find them on the website itself in the usual grant information sections. We also have some key messages for SI and supplier IDD, which really summarize the content of this presentation. And I will be going on in more detail about some of the points of these key messages as well as the guidelines. Could we go to the next slide, please? Now, the important thing is, what is the purpose of IDD? Why are we introducing this? What is it that we're seeking to manage through integrity due diligence? And whilst integrity risk, which I have mentioned, is quite broad, and integrity due diligence is a very broad range of activities, and it can be focused on different types of risks. And we expect that PRs will select what kinds of risks are relevant in a particular context. And there are two big broad buckets of integrity risk, which we're particularly concerned about and which the guidelines really focus on. The first are restrictive measures. These are sanctions, special designations, and prohibitions on transacting, such as asset freezes or similar executive orders issued by national and international authorities. These are orders that basically make it impossible for certain organizations or individuals to be a part of a global fund implementation structure. There are many authorities which issue these kinds of orders, and there is a set which is defined in the guidelines, which is quoted here, which is the United Nations, US OFAC, and the United States State Department, as well as Switzerland. But this list is not exhaustive and may be required and modified by the Global Fund as well. I think many of the PRs that deal with the Global Fund know that this requirement is in place, and we have discussed exactly how it applies in the context that you operate. There can be some changes depending on the context and the sensitivities of which the sanctions list is applicable, and historically there have been special provisions made to this extent. So this minimal list that we have defined in the guidelines is universal, and then it is frequently broadened for most of our contexts, but not all of them. And understanding restrictive measures is one of the key pieces of any kind of integrity due diligence. This understanding enables us to show that we're really committed to fulfilling the standard that the restrictive measures set out. So it is not enough for us to just certify that we are not engaged with any kind of counterparties which are subject to restrictive measures, but the IDD guidelines take a step towards being more proactive in understanding that really these counterparties are excluded through the implementation structure. The second as important part of integrity risk that we're looking to manage is prohibited practices. These are standards which are not set externally, unlike the restrictive measures. These are really core to what the Global Fund does, to the values and the internal procedures of the Global Fund. Really our commitments to doing and our work and fulfilling our mission in a way which safeguards the interests of the world and our recipients as a whole. We're not just seeking to fight the three diseases, but we're seeking to do so in a way which keeps people safe. So the prohibited practices that we're talking about, they are set out in several documents which should be familiar to you. They have been in place for a while, and I will talk a little bit about them here. The first one is the Global Fund Policy to Combat Fraud and Corruption. the PCFC, which has a section on prohibited practices of its own. These are focused at fiduciary and financial concerns, first and foremost, but not just these. So we're talking about fraud, we're talking about bribery and collusion, but also coercion and abuse, retaliation, money laundering, and financing of terrorism. These are prohibited, and IDD makes sure that the counterparties you engage with are not subject to these kinds of misconduct. The second type of prohibited practices is applying or seeking to apply undue influence on global fund decision-making. This requirement comes out of the Global Fund Policy on Conflict of Interest, which has as its covered parties principal recipients as well as sub-recipients and suppliers to implement this. So with regard to conflict of interest, it is necessary to understand exactly what kind of influence and potential links different counterparties have to understand the ability to apply or seek to apply undue influence on global fund related decision making. So IDD with respect to conflicts of interest is about establishing the networks and engagements that key stakeholders have to ensure that they will not be in a position to adversely affect global fund activities due to their competing interests. And the last bucket here under C, sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, and sexual harassment. These are defined in our codes of conduct for recipients as well as for suppliers, and child protection principles, which are also defined in these documents. Now, as you would know, this update to the codes of conduct was relatively recent, but it has been in place for several years. And this kind of conduct is absolutely prohibited, and our implementers and suppliers to them are also required to prohibit it. But besides the prohibition, we're talking about conducting some information gathering and analytical activities to understand that the sub-recipients and suppliers that you engage, whether they're individuals or organizations, are really not engaged in these kinds of conduct. So IDD is about going beyond simply committing to a principle, but doing some proactive work about understanding that the counterparties you engage are really committed in practice to these principles and that their track record shows that they are compliant with them. Managing these risks is what IDD is all about. So could we go to the next slide, please? Integrity due diligence is information and information gathering and analytical activities. That's a very broad field. So as the Global Fund thought about how it will engage on the subject with principal recipients, we have developed several key guiding principles, which stand behind the guidelines and drive really the rest of the content of this presentation. First of all, principal recipients themselves are responsible for integrity due diligence for entities they contract with. And this is in alignment with the core Global Fund principles. So the role of the principal recipient with respect to IDD is really no different with respect than it is with respect to financial risk management or operational risk management. Everything else that the PR does and responsible for ensuring that the Global Fund operations in country run smoothly and that the appropriate risks are managed. IDD is a part of these activities and it is built on the same principle. With regard to the Global Fund, the major principle here is to clearly articulate what are the expectations to the PRs so that we understand how proactive PRs need to be with respect to IDD, and of course, how the existing risk management policies and defined prohibited practices can actually be operationalized to ensure compliance. As a third principle, we understand that some principal recipients might face constraints in terms of their capacity to conduct IDD. They might need to rely on some external help for integrity due diligence. So the Global Fund will onboard a panel of approved vendors that principal recipients can choose to use or where their capacity is insufficient at the moment to meet the current requirements. I will talk a little bit more about how that support will be provided towards the end of the presentation. Really, we have set out the requirements to be very approachable and match what our understanding is of activities that most PRs are already doing. However, because these are requirements that are being set out globally, and the Global Fund implementation structure is incredibly diverse and happens in all sorts of challenging contexts, we understand that in some case, additional support might be needed. And it is for these cases that the support has been designed. Finally, the Global Fund will conduct appropriate compliance monitoring of the guidelines following a risk-based approach to see that they're really being enacted in a way that is designed. Could we go to the next slide, please? Let us dive in more detail into the role of the principal recipients, which is really what the guidelines are all about. The key thing here is that the principal recipients design and execute a risk-based integrity due diligence process for their sub-recipients and suppliers, whether these are individuals or organizations. So for the next few minutes and over several slides, this is what we'll be talking about. Exactly what is a robust IDD process? What needs to be done to make sure that the right activities, the right components in this process are in place? Well, it starts, as it says here, with a risk assessment. The principal recipients engage a wide variety of counterparties, and they're exposed to risk to a different level. Some are already well known to the principal recipient, and their engagement with the Global Fund implementation can be fairly arm's length, with little potential impact on the integrity of the program. So if we're thinking about a supplier which supplies a rudimentary good, something like pencil stationery, which it also supplies to many other organizations in the same country, where the principal recipient doesn't have any kind of close relation with that supplier, and the supplier doesn't have the means to severely impact the Global Fund programs, and it doesn't have access to recipients, to beneficiaries, to vulnerable populations. In this case, the risk would be lower, and a lower level of IDD might be required. But other kinds of suppliers and subrecipients face a high level of risk and have greater exposure to vulnerable populations. And it is in these cases that additional IDD would be required. And so a risk assessment which differentiates the counterparties that the PR relies on is critical to starting off the IDD process and determining what should be the right components with it. So once some individuals and organizations are identified in the risk assessment, classified in accordance with the risk, principal recipients define and implement the appropriate type of screening. And this kind of screening can be conducted in-house, or a PR can use a supplier of its own accord. And from the end of 2024, as I have mentioned, we're looking to pre-approve some vendors so that the PRs could also choose to use in fulfillment of their requirements, should they require the support at all. The screening results that have been defined as a result of the risk assessment process, they need to be used on whether and how to select a subrecipient or supplier. I have mentioned we're screening, amongst other things, for conduct which is outright prohibited, like sexual harassment or fraud. We're also screening for restrictive measures, which, if they're in place, would make it impossible to contract with an assigned supplier unless some special provisions are made. So this screening really needs to happen before any kind of major selection happens, before this individual organization is brought into the implementation structure. As I have mentioned, we expect that most PRs, if not almost all of them, are already doing this kind of screening anyway. Once this decision is made, the screening needs to be updated, and I will talk about this periodicity further on. But it really needs to start already, even before a supplier is selected. Once the screening is done and the integrity relevant information is obtained through the activities that have been selected, you have conducted the research and gathered the relevant facts. Most of the risk management that comes out of integrity due diligence, we expect the PRs to do themselves, because most integrity findings will not arise to the level of prohibited practices or restrictive measures. So we hope that our implementation structure is already quite secure on the key risks and that sanctioned counterparties are not a part of it. Prohibited practices really have been effectively prohibited. We're not expecting to find a lot of sexual abuse in our implementation structure. And that is clearly visible, at least to IDD activities. We understand there is always, unfortunately, misconduct which is going on below the radar, and IDD is not going to establish all facts, but at least with regard to egregious and publicly known misconduct, we expect that it should be an incredibly rare finding. Now, there might be other integrity-related findings as a result of integrity due diligence, and this is what we expect to happen, and these, the PRs would manage themselves. Now, in the highly unusual case that there is an outright breach of prohibited practices or of restrictive measures, of course, PRs need to communicate this finding to the Global Fund and describe exactly what kind of information has been found with regard to which counterparty. These kinds of findings need to be escalated on the basis of already existing disclosure obligations, which you have in the codes of conduct. You also have them in the grant agreements. So in here, again, we're not talking about setting a new requirement as a part of the guidelines, rather the existing obligations, which are already in the grant agreements, obligate the PRs to disclose and notify to the Global Fund of these findings as and when they happen. If we go to the next slide, please. So for the next few minutes, let us talk in more detail about what a robust process looks like once a risk assessment has been carried out. Firstly, IDD, we understand, is quite a complex and context-sensitive topic. This is why the guidelines spend a lot of time on the overall expectations that are set out towards the PRs. There is the risk assessment, which I already talked about, which is the critical first piece for the principal recipient to understand the risk context that it operates in, understand the kind of classes of counterparties that it engages, which suppliers are really critical, which sub-recipients have most exposure to vulnerable populations, which kinds of counterparties have a track record in our jurisdiction of engaging in misconduct. Where do we know misconduct just tends to happen? This will vary from country to country and from PR to PR. So each PR needs to do its own risk assessment and understand what are the hotspots for integrity risk in my case. If we were to find restrictive measures in place, like, let's say, organization subjects to terrorism sanctions or due to terrorism financing, what part of implementation is most exposed to these kinds of risks? This needs to be understood so that an appropriate IDD process can then be defined for all of these counterparties. And a result of the classification is a setting of IDD activities. I will talk on further slides about exactly what these IDD activities can entail, but many of those will be familiar to you. They are things like web searches, media searches, conducting network inquiries, querying appropriate databases. Once you have understood what the risk landscape looks like for your counterparties, you would have set the right level of activities for all of your counterparties. You would have understood where a simple database check is enough, where you might need to do some additional web searches, and where you might need to request disclosures or conduct network inquiries and really dive deeper to understand the risk profile of a particular counterparty you're engaging before you're engaging it, but also as your engagement of that counterparty develops over time. And this IDD process is really the heart of what IDD is, conducting the checks on the modality that you have chosen, learning who your counterparties are, making sure that you have the right information available, sourced from the public record or from network inquiries so that you can make the right decisions. Once this IDD screening using the relevant information sources is done, then the PR can use it as a part of its decision-making. So as I have mentioned, in some cases, it can lead to a decision of whether to retain a counterparty or disengage from it entirely. This will especially be the case if there is some indication that prohibited practices are ongoing right now in this counterparty, or that the track record is so severe that the counterparty cannot be trusted to, in practice, prohibit the misconduct, or that counterparty is subject to restrictive measures. But disengagement from the counterparty isn't always the result of IDD. Often through integrity due diligence, you find out information which you can then use to engage the counterparty, but in a more meaningful way and in a safer way. The IDD can inform the mitigations and the risk management measures you have in place when engaging a particular kind of counterparty. Again, this is something that principal recipients already do. They put greater attention to some counterparties where they know that risks in particular might manifest. So these are the counterparties that you obtain further disclosures from, that you conduct more frequent site visits to, that you monitor with greater attention. And these kinds of mitigations are also informed by IDD. So IDD is not just about doing business or not doing business with a particular individual organization. It's really about informing your risk management procedures of the entire course of the engagement of the counterparty. But there are also some minimum requirements. So what I have talked about for now is really broad picture, and it covers all the counterparties that a principal recipient might engage, subjecting them to risk assessment, understanding what kind of IDD process is appropriate for each class of individuals and organizations. This will be highly variant. This is why the Global Fund is not mandating how an IDD process for each PR should look like, because PRs understand much better their own risk context. They understand where attention needs to be paid, which kind of counterparties need to be screened. So this is really left with the PRs, but at the same time, the Global Fund does need to set some minimum requirements. So this is kind of a bare bones risk assessment to the extent that this component of IDD needs to be present in all PR programs. So regardless of what the risk context and the other activities that the PR undertakes, we feel that these activities, which constitute the minimum requirements, really must be in place everywhere. Of course, fulfilling the minimum requirements doesn't actually mean that you fulfill the overall expectations, because these minimum requirements, they are really minimum. They do not replace the risk assessment. They do not replace considering all of your counterparties. They just state that if this component is not a part of your IDD program, then your IDD program is for sure not robust. But any robust IDD program needs to have something more than just the minimum requirements. So what are the minimum requirements that we have set? These are fairly light because they are set universally for all of our PRs, including those that have lower capacity and operate in more challenging environments. So especially for a more mature PR, we will always be going quite far beyond the minimum requirements. But any PR, no matter how low capacity, we expect to meet at least these. At least subrecipient and supplier organizations with budgets above 5 million over the grant cycle, and we're talking about individual budgets here. So not all suppliers or all PRs in aggregate, but individual SR and individual supply organizations with grant cycle budgets of over 5 million. Not just organizations themselves, but also their key staff, especially with respect to subrecipients. So the signatory, whoever signs the SR agreement with the PR on behalf of the SR, but also their key managers, the program or PMU head, the head of the organization, normally the director, the chief executive officer, and the other roles that we have set out here. Not every SR might have these roles, but if they have these roles, they are subject to minimum requirements. So these organizations and these individuals need to be checked against defined lists with respect to restrictive measures and prohibited practices. The lists I have already talked about with regard to restrictive measures. And these same lists also mention the prohibited practices, especially fraud, terrorism financing, sexual abuse, and sexual harassment. So if on the defined lists that are set out in the guidelines, the UN lists and the US OFAC lists, the Switzerland lists, these individuals are listed for these activities or for any kind of restrictive measures, they need to be screened out. And this is what the minimum requirement is, just making sure that this defined population is checked against at least these kinds of lists. Now, as I mentioned, the requirements are minimum, so we don't feel that these lists are necessarily sufficient. It's just that this is a component that must be present in any kind of IDD program. And then, as I mentioned previously, we expect the PR to also use the right kind of information for its own context and the right kind of checks for its own context to ensure that a robust risk management process is in place and the right kind of information is queried with regard to the right organizations. If you go to the next slide, please. So for now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the information sources available for IDD screening, because up to now I have been talking a little bit abstractly about IDD checks. So let me talk in more detail about exactly what these are. The first one is open source research, which includes research by querying specific databases and websites with regard to certain prohibited practices and integrity risk management information. But this also includes open source research such as web searches and media searches. In this list, we just aggregate the use of the public record to understand the integrity track record of a counterparty. In the modern world, this comes in many forms. You have the online and social media, and you also have the national and international databases. They will vary from country to country. Some countries maintain specific databases with regard to particular kind of misconduct, especially in countries, for example, more exposed to terrorism financing or terrorist activities. There will normally be a database specific to that. In a country where human trafficking is a big issue, there might be a specific database with regard to that. So, for example, Kenya has a human trafficking and modern slavery database, which covers specifically the Kenyan individuals. All this comprises open source research, and there's one of the basic and best ways of conducting a basic standard of IDD. One thing that I have already mentioned, but let me stress it again, are the specific restrictive measures lists. So these are maintained by national and international authorities, and in particular, the guidelines we have set out focus on UN sanctions, US sanctions, and Switzerland sanctions. And these are available online, so all of these authorities maintain their own websites, like the UN, the US, and the Switzerland one. But there are also many providers which aggregate multiple sanctions lists into one place. So you can do a single query in one place rather than going to the website of each authority to check the name of organization and individual. The Global Fund is completely fine with PRs using the right kind of tool, like an aggregate tool to use to check many sanctions lists at once, and to these kinds of tools allow customization and allow the PR to select the set of sanctions lists that they would like to check. And the Global Fund itself uses an aggregate tool like this. These are incredibly useful. Some of them are free, some of them are subscription-based. For a free one, I would mention the nonprofit project of opensanctions.org, which aggregate a wide range of lists. But they're also for-profit providers, which can provide a more customized product and which the PRs can use to assist in their open source research. But of course, open source research does not exhaust the screening modalities that are available to the PRs. Another critical one are self-disclosures and questionnaires. Normally, as a part of your procurement or your recruitment, you would already be requesting things like CVs or supplier questionnaires with critical information like ownership and control. And this is also the chance to request self-disclosure of exposure to competing interests. This is critical for conflict of interest management, as well as disclose any ongoing or past litigation and investigations. Confirm that you're not that the organization is not subject to restrictive measures, and also describe the historical incidents of misconduct that the counterparty may have faced. This last one is a useful complement to open source research, because you might have found online that a particular counterparty has been engaged or has been linked to a large corruption scandal, maybe has been investigated by your local authorities. In a self-disclosure, this is a chance for them to comment and describe how they have addressed these allegations, how they have matured their processes, and how the organization is now more protected than against this kind of misconduct than it has been previously, perhaps. Or they can address the allegations as being unfounded, for example, and as unfounded allegations also happen. Besides self-disclosures, you can obtain independent verification of the information of track record, especially on integrity of the counterparty. So interviewing relevant individuals in the network that all of our principal recipients have. People who have previously worked with or at the subrecipient or supply organization that you are using, people that are knowledgeable about the regulatory track record of that counterparty and can provide an informed view of the integrity standing. These can form a very important part of IDD, or more enhanced type IDD, where you're paying more attention to a specific counterparty and you're ready to dive deeper, because they can bring out information which is not in a public record, but also can bring very important context. It could be that a particular SR has had problems in dealing with vulnerable populations, and there might have been instances of misconduct when SR has operated in a particular area, and the network inquiries with knowledgeable individuals can provide the required context and explain why in that particular area the SR might have had problems which have been historical, but in a different geographical area, the SR has much better track record because maybe of some local contextual issues which make it difficult for that subrecipient to operate in that particular area, maybe make it more difficult for that SR to retain higher quality staff in a particular region, whilst at the same time in a different region that the SR has a stellar integrity track record. This kind of information will rarely come from the public record. It normally requires talking to people who are really familiar with the history of the organization. And this is relevant and useful where you know that the risks are high and that the potential impact of an integrity failure is high, especially when, for example, vulnerable populations are involved. This kind of screening through network inquiries can be useful. Of course, you can also conduct these inquiries formally. This is point D. You can request formal references from the subrecipients and supply organizations. The good thing about formal inquiries is that normally you would be provided with references. The weaker part of it is, of course, that these are references normally that would speak well to the subject that they address. And the network inquiries that are conducted informally and by the principal recipient themselves, rather than by relying on the contacts provided by the subrecipient, can be more effective. Finally, there are IDD vendors. This is the point E. I have mentioned that there are organizations which are focused on conducting integrity due diligence in all its various forms. Some organizations focus on open source research, some actually conduct the network inquiries, some can do a mixture of both. And the PRs can use these organizations, especially that are locally active and have good local networks and a good understanding of the local public record, Maybe these organizations have access to databases or subscription sources that the PR might not have access to. For all these reasons, using an IDD vendor can be a sensible way to structure IDD. And as I have mentioned, the Global Fund would seek to pre-approve some IDD vendors that have global scope and that can support some PRs that have challenges in onboarding an IDD vendor of the sort by themselves, or that have challenges of in sourcing the IDD activities. But I will talk a little bit more about this later. Could we go to the next slide, please? Critical part is timing. So I have mentioned this already. Because the risks that IDD seeks to manage are so critical, some of it must be conducted prior to any substantive commencement of a relationship with a subrecipient or supplier. As I have mentioned, PRs are already doing this, making sure that a subrecipient or supplier is not subject to restrictive measures and that it does not have an egregious and blatant track record of engagement in prohibited practices. We would not select a subrecipient which is actually actively engaged in human rights abuses somewhere that cannot be trusted with vulnerable populations as a part of our implementation programs. So this is I think, well understood. What we also mention in the guidelines is that PRs are expected to refresh their IDD. It is not sufficient to just do the screening before the substantive engagement, especially with regard to a counterparty that you retain over multiple years. And you have last checked maybe a decade ago. The risk context involves and the track record of a counterparty involves the internal mechanisms in a SI and supplier can change, and the previously robust supplier can become more exposed to risk. So rescreening is essential, and we set out the requirement to do it at least once per grant period. So even if the same counterparties are retained in the new grant period, PRs are expected to redo their screening. And with respect to minimal requirements, this is a requirement to do so every grant period. It is also possible that the contexts evolve. Many of our principal recipients operate, unfortunately, in areas subject to conflict, subject to rapidly evolving geopolitical situations, and especially in these cases, restrictive measures can be very dynamic. We have seen this recently, unfortunately, in many of the jurisdictions where we operate. And where significant changes to restrictive measures regimes take place, again, the screenings need to be updated because the counterparty that you have previously screened and could have been fined due to the evolution of the restrictive measures could now be a screened counterparty. So we expect PRs to respond to significant changes in restrictive measures by updating their screenings. Now, I have mentioned this previously, and let me say this again here, that the scope of IDD can be subject to exceptions. The contexts that our PRs operate in are highly different. And in some cases, the Global Fund needs to make specific measures to provide for the particularly sensitive conditions in which some of our PRs operate in very fragile contexts and contexts of active conflict. If we have representatives from PRs on a call that have been through this process, you would know that there are the Global Fund is very dynamic and proactive in engaging in these situations and working out a specific solution that works in a particular context and that can allow our implementation to proceed, notwithstanding the difficulties that we're facing. So the Global Fund will continue this practice, and I have been talking about the default requirements, but of course, sometimes they would need to be adjusted, and you would work with your CT and the Global Fund, the Secretariat, to establish the right scope of IDD if the default, for some reason, cannot apply, or on the other hand, if we need to go beyond the default and apply stronger requirements because of the higher risk that is manifesting in a particular jurisdiction. Could we go to the next slide, please? So just to take us back and do a quick overview of what we have talked about and what a robust IDD process looks like. You start with assessing risk, identifying the risk factors that are particularly relevant to a PR's implementation context. You assess the risk levels against the classes and cohorts of counterparties that you have, and you select and match the IDD modality to risk level, making sure that more intensive IDD is being done on subrecipients and suppliers in cases where these are more exposed to risk and where an integrity failure could have more severe and more egregious consequences for our beneficiaries, as well as for the overall implementation of the Global Fund mission. So once this matching has happened on the policy level, the actual screenings occur. So once you actually go forward and engage a particular supplier or a particular subrecipient, you select the modality in line with the risk assessment and perform the IDD screening, collecting the information. Once the information is collected, the PR reviews it internally. As I have mentioned, we expect that only rarely would escalation to the Global Fund be needed. This would be in cases where you have established through IDD that a subrecipient or supply organization might be engaged in prohibited conduct right now with regard to the Global Fund implementation. And there are existing obligations for disclosing these kinds of findings to the Secretariat and to the OIG. Most of the time, though, the review would be internal to the PR, and the PR will decide to select or terminate an implementer or supplier, depending on the risk level and the risk context and the findings that have been established through IDD. I have mentioned previously that often the IDD results in retaining an organization, but with application of additional mitigations to counteract whatever adverse findings have been established. So you might find a supplier which had a history of corruption, but which has now reformed itself, which has been through an official process, and that process has concluded. With this kind of supplier, you could retain it, but also know that you need to be particularly alert to corruption risks. So you might have a more intensive auditing requirements, stronger contractual requirements, more frequent supervisions, greater fiduciary control. So IDD can inform a very broad range of actions. From the Global Fund side, this is the blue, we would verify the compliance with minimal requirements that I talked about, and we will engage with PRs to identify whether PRs need to outsource some of the IDD to meet the requirements. I will talk a little bit more about this on the next slide, if you could go to it, please. So you will see that some PRs are subject to LFA verification. Where this is the case, the LFA check would happen just as it happens for existing assurance and risk management procedures. We are working on adding this new scope to LFA verifications, but because this is fairly straightforward and checking that the process is in place, we don't anticipate any major changes to the LFA process, and we expect to conduct it within the existing schedules of site visits and checks that the LFAs conduct. Simply, the scope will be expanded to add this new piece. As they do the assurance, they would also verify that an IDD program is in place, and we will be verifying specifically the minimum requirements that I have talked about. So the populations that are specified in the minimum requirements, that they have been checked against the specific restrictive measures lists. We will not be at this point verifying the overall IDD process, but PRs are expected to have it in place. And so the LFA verification can evolve over time. At the moment, we are only focusing on minimum requirements, but that does not mean that the minimum requirements exhaust the IDD requirements. This will be reported to the Secretariat as normally, and then I have mentioned we might introduce vendor-supported IDD for some PRs, where pre-approved vendor by the Global Fund is used. In this case, there will be some continuous reporting to the Secretariat of the work that this pre-approved vendor is doing. This would allow us a more kind of live, continuous monitoring of the situation, and will make it easier for the Global Fund to provide the required support and adjust the scope, making sure that requirements are being complied with and obligations are being met. If we go to the next slide, I think we are nearing the end. Yes. So I saw that there were questions in the chat. We have a little bit of time, so let me go over these now. And thank you very much for following through on this presentation. It is quite a lot of content, and we talk about different aspects, the risk assessment, the process itself, and then how it looks as a part of the overall Global Fund administration. So we will share the presentation. And all of this content really is also in the guidelines. So the top line is that please read the guidelines, and you can consult with your country teams for further advice. But we have tried to design the guidelines to be really comprehensive, readable, and to answer the questions that you may have. First question, can you confirm the guidance applies to all SRs and suppliers? So the guidance does indeed apply to all SRs and suppliers. I have talked about PRs building a robust IDD process to do a risk assessment of all the SRs and suppliers that they have, and to select themselves what is the right IDD modality with regards to all counterparties that they rely on. What we have also done in the minimum requirements is we kind of preempted a very small part of this risk assessment to say that, look, there are these kinds of counterparties with regard to which at least this kind of IDD needs to be done. So for sure, this component of IDD must be present in any robust IDD program, but this component by no means exhausts a robust IDD program. It is simply something that we understand to be a universal requirement. And then each PR, by understanding of its context, will better understand what else needs to be done beyond the minimum requirements to make sure that the IDD program is robust. But the minimum requirements is something that is universally applicable, and also something that is possible for the Global Fund to check and verify against a pretty clear standard. Whereas the rest of the IDD program, this is really up to the principal recipient's contextual judgment and then understanding of the risk, which the Global Fund doesn't want to second guess. We trust our principal recipients. They have been selected exactly because they're able to do the appropriate risk management procedures. So it's up to them to choose what kind of IDD to apply to what kind of subrecipients and suppliers. And yes, so the next question is similar. Does the key stuff apply on the financial threshold? Yeah, so all of these questions are really on the same tack. And so let me just confirm, the IDD is applicable everywhere, right? So the PR needs to understand who are we engaged with, what is the right information to gather about the people and organizations that we're bringing into the Global Fund implementation structure. This question is universal, right? You need to ask the question about everybody. And you need to ask the question, well, what is the right level of checks that we need to do? With regard to some individuals and organizations, this question is kind of preempted. For sure, with regard to these very large suppliers, with regard to their critical roles, we need to at least do this. So the Global Fund has decided that there is a subset of IDD which is simply not subject to question, and that the PR doesn't even need to think about, because for sure this needs to be done with regard to these people. With regard to everybody else, the PR needs to think what is the right level of activities. So nobody is excluded from IDD, because prohibited practices and restrictive measures, they apply to everybody, right? You cannot retain a sanctioned supplier if it has a small budget. That's not how it works. If a supplier is under sanction, then it cannot be retained. The question is, how does the PR go about checking that the supplier is sanctioned? What kind of checks? How frequently would they need to be done? This will depend on the maturity of the PR, the resources that are available, and the Global Fund does not seek to be too prescriptive in this area because we understand that the context is different. So rather than dictating to each PR what needs to be done, we have set minimum requirements which are universal and which we feel can be met even in very low capacity contexts. So there are no kind of predefined exclusions. In all cases, at least this kind of IDD needs to be done. For the rest, it is up to the PR to select the right level. But the guidelines themselves are universal. The prohibited practices are universal. The risk assessment that we talked about applies to all of your counterparties, which also kind of makes sense because if minimum requirements were the only thing, then why do the risk assessment at all, right? The minimum requirements are already kind of the result of a risk assessment. So they need to be complemented. You need to do your own. Next question. If a PR has its own risk assessment process, they follow their process or they must adapt to the specific IDD process that the Global Fund has set. So this is what I have covered, right? We do not want to dictate a process. It is exactly, we expect PRs to have their own processes. We expect these processes to be robust. The only thing that we do dictate is that one of the results of your process must be that you do at least the minimum requirements checks as well as the other checks that your process returns. So if your own process does not meet at least minimum requirements, then there will be a conversation of, how is it that you have come to that decision, and it will be difficult for the Global Fund to accept properly. But most of the time, it is the PR's own risk assessment process that drives the decision. And we don't expect that there would be difference, right? That we don't expect that any risk assessment process would reasonably say that even for these very large subrecipients and suppliers with these very large budgets of over 5 million, you should not do at least the sanctions check. Because, any reasonable risk assessment process, we believe at the moment, should at least should at least result in doing this and much more than this. Next question. When the risk-based assessment done by the PR highlights that IDD would be required, could mean a significant workload, as well as formalizing all the checks. So would the Global Fund be prepared to finance additional stuff? So as with other risk management activities, this obligation is a part of principal recipient's general obligations, right? The principal recipient signs up to have prohibited certain activities. It signs up to not have engaged counterparties that are subject to, that are on, for example, terrorism blacklists, right? So just as with regular risk management processes in things like finance, the Global Fund grants do not normally finance the administrative infrastructure, which is a precondition for the principal recipient to be able to do its job. So the principal recipient must have the right institutional processes in place to be selected as a principal recipient. One of these is the ability to manage its integrity risk, just like one of its requirements is to manage the financial books. Of course, this can be quite the workload from this is substantial. Of course, the financial management is much more onerous than integrity risk management, and yet this is what we expect PRs to do without having specific budget items allocated to this out of grants. What would be the interviews in the network of the PRs or SR? So this could be just the PR reaching out to the people that it knows informally or formally. Over email, over the phone, over just over a cup of coffee, talking to people that know the subrecipient or the supplier and getting their view and getting their information, their history of having worked with the supplier. So this is really an addition, and it's quite a deep form of IDD. So it would normally be in place only if the risks are really critical, where you really need to understand whether you can trust a supplier, maybe because they're operating in a particular sensitive area, and you cannot just rely on paper documents that they have submitted to select them. You really need to understand more. And then you would go out, rely on your network, your former colleagues, your professional network, to obtain that additional information. Who is the focal point within the Global Fund for questions after this call? So your CT is the primary focal point, and the CT can escalate to the legal team and to the ethics team, depending on exactly the nature of the questions. And the 5 million threshold applies to the grant cycle rather than to the year. So it is at a particular budget that the PR has compiled. If that budget allocates more than 5 million for the grant cycle, then that organization is in scope of minimum requirements. Are these all the questions, or are there more? I think this is the
Artem, yeah, we have another slide with a few more questions. It's just we have interpretation for around 10 more minutes. So if we can go through as many questions as you can, but we'll break at 12:10, and then we'll respond to participants separately with the remaining questions that you're not able to cover. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, so the high and very high external risk index, you will see that this referenced in the guidelines. This is what will drive the global fund decision-making around verifications. So for the PRs, it is less relevant because the guidelines apply to all PRs, whether or not you are in a particular risk index category. This is more internally for developing the decision-making around the verifications. Have the IDD tools or guidelines available for PRs? Can they be adjusted based on the country context? So yes, the guidelines have been designed to be very flexible and to let the PRs use the contextual knowledge and develop its own IDD program relevant and fit for the resources and the risk context that it's facing. So this is why the minimal requirements are fairly light, and most of the content of the guidelines is not in the minimum requirements, but in overall expectations, which just set out the principles which we think are universally applicable, and they are flexible. So the principle of risk assessment and then matching the IDD modality to the risk that you have established puts a lot of responsibility on the PRs, but also leaves the flexibility of the PRs to design the IDD program relevantly for their own context. With respect to the question 9, the content of the LFA verification, this is being developed. We will consider the risks and the capacities of the PRs. It could be that it is sufficient to display evidence that the process has been completed. We might also do some rechecks. They can be done by the LFA, or they can be done internally at the Global Fund, because of course we do our own sanctions checks and we do our own IDD as well. The precise determination of that is still to be seen, and yeah, the PRs should be, in any case, what is required by the PR is to display that the process has been done. If we then decide to do the recheck, that is on our side and wouldn't affect the interaction with the PR. Are there credible GF-approved platforms that can be used to conduct IDD? So the best credible approved platforms are the websites of the national and international authorities that issue their sanctions decisions. So the UN has a website, US OFAC has a website, Switzerland Sanctions have a website. And then there are numerous providers which aggregate different websites and do so also robustly and have a long track record of operating. So the PR can choose a robust provider that is comfortable, delivers the content of the check. We are not requiring that any particular tool is used, just that the tool is effective. I have mentioned one free tool, which is opensanctions.org. I mentioned it because it's a nonprofit. There are numerous for-profit tools, but I would rather not name specific names, as the Global Fund is completely neutral with regard to any commercial provider that you may use. So there is no question of a platform being approved or not. Any platform that effectively fulfills the function that is required, which actually checks the lists, would be sufficient to fulfill it. So any platform can be used. You just need to make sure that the platform really does what it says it does. And we list the specific sources that it needs to query. Normally, these platforms, they will give you a source list. They will tell you which kind of sanctions lists they check. You just need to make sure that this content is aligned with the expectation of the Global Fund. If there is alignment, the platform will be perfectly fine. Does the Global Fund have channeling or email address to vet the individual organization? So the Global Fund will not be doing the IDD. Doing the IDD is the responsibility of the PRs. PRs have the context, they have the right information available, they have access to local sources, which have much more information. And, similarly with other kinds of risk management, the Global Fund is not taking over any kind of vetting. This is left to the PRs. Let's see how many we can do in the remaining 5 minutes. That's it. Okay. Thank you very much for your questions, and thank you very much for joining the presentation. From your questions, I see that you have really followed the content, and I'm glad the topic is of interest and also understood by the PRs. This is what we expect. I've seen there were several tools, several specific commercial tools mentioned already, which is as we expected. We know that many of our PRs already use them. And really, we expect that the guidelines that we have issued are not a surprise to our principal recipients, because they do have risk management processes in place to address these risks. The requirements that underlie these guidelines, they are not new. The policies, like the policy to combat fraud and corruption, have been in place for many years. And also, of course, the requirements of the Global Fund here are no different from requirements of many other national and international donors and multilateral donors, which also require that their recipients do integrity risk management. So I hope this was informative, and I hope the verification process, once it's in place, will go smoothly. If you do have further questions, you can contact the country teams, which have also received information about this. There are also the key messages, but ultimately the guidelines are available on the website, and they provide a bit more detail. It's a relatively long document, but it's quite comprehensive, and it should be able to answer most of your questions. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining again. And yeah, we'll look forward to continuing the great work of the Global Fund. And thank you for delivering the implementation in country and managing the risks the way that you have done.